Very good morning to all of you. This is Abhilsha, your social science teacher. So, students, today we all are going to continue our chapter number 4 of your history textbook. The name of the chapter is Tribals, Dikus, and the Vision of the Golden Age. In our last class, uh, some were hunter gatherers and some were June cultivators, and these were the two methods through which tribal groups lived. Okay, and now the third one is some herded animals. Some of the tribal groups, some of the tribal people are herded animals. They herded animals and they lived their earning. So many tribal groups lived by herding and rearing animals. They were pastoralists who moved with their herds or of cattle or sheep according to the seasons. When the grass in one place was exhausted, they moved to another area. The one Gujars of Punjab, please underline the statement, the one Gujars of Punjab Hills and the Labadis of Andhra Pradesh were cattle herders, the Gaddis of Kullu were shepherds, the Bakarwals of Kashmir reared goats. Okay, we will talk about it um, uh, uh, elaborately about these tribal groups next year in our history book. Okay, so now some herd animals, they reared animals, they were pastoralists. Pastoralists, who are pastoralists? Pastoralists are those tribal groups who rear animals, who herd animals and move from one place to another place with their livestock. ठीक है, एक place से दूसरे प्लेस वो मूव करते हैं. ट्राइबल ग्रुप्स ही होते हैं, एक प्लेस से दूसरे प्लेस में मूव करते हैं अपने अपने कैटल्स के साथ और या फिर शीप के साथ. So if you have observed, whenever you come to school, maybe you have seen some of the sheep or goats, like they were herded by the by one or two person, like they are like taking them to the grazing land. ठीक है, ग्रेजिंग लैंड में लेके जा रहे होते हैं. तो आपने मे भी ऑब्जर्व किया होगा, हमारे स्कूल के सामने, हमारे स्कूल के आसपास में काफी ऐसे हर्डर्स और ये शेफर्ड्स वगैरह हमें देखने को मिलते हैं. ओके, so now these were the famous tribal groups from these particular areas, from Punjab Hills, One Gujars, Andhra Pradesh, Labadis, Gaddis of Kullu, shepherds and Bakarwals of Kashmir, they rear goats. Okay, so now our next some took to settled cultivation. Now some of them were agriculturists. They settled in a place and they cultivate, they do farming. Okay, so even before the 19th century, many from within the tribal groups had begun settling down and cultivating their fields in one place year after year, instead of moving from place to place. Normally what we have studied earlier, like we studied about June cultivators, shipping cultivators. They move from one place to another place. They move from one place to another place. They did farming. They did farming at one place, and after a certain time after harvesting, they moved to another place. Okay, and for some years they didn't come back to that particular field. So that was shifting cultivation. But now some tribal groups also settled down in a place and they started their they cultivating their fields in one place year after year. So they begin to use the plow. In June cultivators, we have seen they did not use plow. Instead of plow, they use hoe. Okay, and gradually got rights over the land they lived on. और धीरे धीरे क्या हुआ, उनको जिस लैंड में वो रह रहे थे उस लैंड पे लैंड राइट्स मिल गए कि these lands belong to these particular person. In many cases, like the Mundas of Chotanagpur, the land belonged to the clan as a whole. ठीक है, क्लैन मतलब कि आप ये बोल सकते हो मुंडा कम्युनिटी को ही एक बोला है कि मुंडा के जितने भी लोग हैं वो एक क्लैन है, ठीक है, कि इन्हीं के एंसेस्टर्स ने इनको यहाँ पे सेटल किया था और इनकी जितने इनका जो भी वंश होगा वो ही इस लैंड में रह सकता है. दैट इज नोन एज क्लैन. ओके, सो द लैंड बिलोंग टू द क्लैन एज अ होल. ऑल members of the clan were regarded as descendants of the original settlers who had first cleared the land. Therefore, all of them had rights on the land. Very often, some people within the clan acquired more power than others. Some became chiefs and other followers. Powerful men often rented out their land instead of cultivating it themselves. Now, all members of the clan, all members of that particular community, they become the descendants. ठीक है, जो भी original settlers थे जिन्होंने पहले land को clear किया था for the cultivation, वो उनके original settlers के descendant मतलब कि वंश माने जाते हैं. descendant मतलब कि आप जो अधिकार है आपका, आपके फादर के बाद आपका अधिकार होता है, ठीक है, तो that is known as like descendants कि अब इस land में rights जो हैं अब आपके हैं. सो कुछ लोग क्या है, कुछ क्लैन में कुछ मेंबर्स ऐसे थे जिनके पास बहुत ज्यादा पावर थे, वो चीफ्स बन गए और कुछ लोग उनके फॉलोवर्स बन गए. कुछ जो पावरफुल मैन थे वो इवन खुद कल्टीवेट नहीं करते थे लैंड, पर लैंड को रेंट में दे दिया करते थे. British officials saw settled tribal groups like the Gonds and Santhals as more civilized than hunter-gatherers or shifting cultivators. Those who lived in the forest were considered to be wild and savage. They needed to be settled and civilized. Now, ब्रिटिश ऑफिशियल्स जो थे वो ऐसे लोगों को क्या समझते थे, ऐसे ट्राइबल ग्रुप्स को जैसे स्पेशली गॉन्ड्स एंड संथल्स को, वो मानते थे कि ये हंटर गैदरर्स और शिफ्टिंग कल्टीवेटर्स से काफी सिविलाइज्ड है, काफी अच्छी तरीके से उनको जीना आता है, सेटल्ड है. गॉन्ड्स ये और दूसरे जो ट्राइबल ग्रुप्स है स्पेशली हंटर गैदरर्स एंड शिफ्टिंग कल्टीवेटर्स, दे मूव फ्रॉम वन प्लेस टू अनदर प्लेस एंड इवन if you want to contact with them, it is like difficult to contact with them. Okay, so that's why they prefer settled cultivators. They preferred settled cultivators as they can acquire revenue from them easily as compared to the shifting cultivators and hunter gatherers. Okay, so those who lived in the forests were considered to be wild and savage. उनको wild और ऐसे जंगली माना जाता था. They needed to be settled and civilized. According to them, they needed to be more civilized. They needed to be settled. They, according to the British officials. So, how did colonial rule affect tribals' life? Till now, we have studied about the ways through which tribal group lived. Some were Jmu cultivators, some herded animals, some were hunter gatherers, some were settled cultivators. Now, ये जो कॉलोनियल रूल से जब ब्रिटिशर्स इंडिया में आए, उन्होंने इंडिया को अपनी कॉलोनी बनाई, आफ्टर दैट हाउ दिस रूल, हाउ कॉलोनियल रूल अफेक्टेड देयर लाइव्स, स्पेशली ट्राइबल लाइव्स. So the lives of tribal groups changed during British rule. Let us see what these changes were. What happened to the tribal chiefs? Tribal chiefs आपने सुना होगा, सरदार सुना होगा एक टर्म. अगर आपने कोई ओल्ड मूवीज वगैरह देखी है तो वहां पे हमें देखने को मिलता है कि गांव में एक सरदार होते हैं, चीफ होते हैं, ठीक है. तो नाउ बिफोर द अराइवल्स ऑफ द ब्रिटिश इन मेनी एरियाज द ट्राइबल चीफ्स वर इम्पोर्टेंट पीपल. They enjoyed a certain amount of economic power and had the right to administer and control their territories. Now, before British, like tribal chiefs were important persons. They enjoyed economic power, social power. They had all the rights to manage and control their lands or territories. In some places, they had their own police and decided on the local rules of land and forest management. So in some places they had their own police, like उनके खुद की पुलिस होती थी, and decided on the local rules of land and forest management कि हमें अपने लैंड को कैसे प्रोटेक्ट करना है, हमारे लोकल रूल जो है लैंड का वो कैसे रहेगा, मतलब जितने भी मैनेजमेंट रिलेटेड कि हमें फॉरेस्ट को कैसे मैनेज करना है, या जितने भी आपके एडमिनिस्ट्रेटिव पावर्स थी वो सब सरदार ट्राइबल चीफ्स के पास थी. Under British rule, the functions and powers of the tribal chiefs changed considerably. They were allowed to keep their land titles over a cluster of villages. Cluster means group of villages, and rent out lands. But they lost much of their administrative power and were forced to follow laws made by British officials in India. They also had to pay tribute to the British and discipline the tribal groups on behalf of the British. They lost the authority they had earlier enjoyed amongst their people and were unable to fulfill their traditional functions. Now, Britishers wanted what Britishers did to tribal chiefs. The functions and powers of the tribal chiefs changed after the arrival of the British. They allowed to keep their land titles. They have that name. Okay, they have had that name, land titles name. कि आप सरदार हो, okay, but just for the sake of the name, they were they hold those land titles over a cluster of villages, और वो rent भी कर सकते थे lands को. But जो powers थी, administrative powers, आपकी laws बनाने की power, ये सारी की सारी powers अब British officials के पास में थी, and they had to follow those powers of the British officials. So even they paid tribute to the British. ठीक है कि Britishers क्या चाहते हैं, उनको tribute भी pay किया जाता था. Tribute means you can say when you show that you respect somebody, that is known as tribute. You are admiring someone, you are admiring something. ठीक है, तो even tribal chiefs admire British officials. ठीक है, they had to pay tribute to the British. मतलब चाहे वो जबरदस्ती ही क्यों ना हो, like forcefully क्यों ना हो, but they had to and discipline the tribal groups on behalf of the British. Like वो जितने भी Britishers उनको commands देते थे, they followed those commands, and they disciplined the tribal groups, and they administered the tribal groups, but according to the British officials. They lost the authority they had earlier enjoyed amongst their people and were unable to fulfill their traditional functions. कि अब देखिए जितनी भी अथॉरिटी थी, उनकी पावर थी, वो सब कुछ हो चुके थे, ठीक है, बट एंड दे वर अनेबल टू फुलफिल देयर ट्रेडिशनल फंक्शंस. जितने भी उनके ट्रेडिशनल फंक्शंस, रिचुअल्स वगैरह थे, वो फॉलो नहीं कर पाते थे बिकॉज ऑफ द अराइवल ऑफ द ब्रिटिशर्स, बिकॉज ऑफ द लॉज मेड बाय द ब्रिटिशर्स. ओके, so now what happened to the shifting cultivators? We talked about tribal chiefs. Now before that, just look at this picture. In this figure, a log house being built in a village of Nishi tribes of Arunachal Pradesh. The entire village helps when log huts are built. Now, ये जो आपकी पिक्चर है, इसमें हम क्या देखते हैं, आंध्र प्रदेश की एक ट्राइबल ग्रुप है, वो है निशी ग्रुप. वो क्या करते हैं, वो लॉग हाउस क्या होता है, जो पेड़ के जो ये सपोज दिस इज द ब्रांच ऑफ अ ट्री, ठीक है, उसको जब कट कर देते हैं तो आपने इस तरीके का एक वुड का जो आप पीस देखते हो, इसको हम लॉग बोलते हैं. क्या बोलते हैं, लॉग बोलते हैं. सो दिस इज सो दे मेड द लॉग हाउस, एंड जब भी कोई भी लॉग हाउस बनता था तो सब लोग उनकी हेल्प किया करते थे लॉग हाउस बनाने. ठीक है. So now what happened to the shifting cultivators, झूम cultivators, या फिर मध्य प्रदेश में बात करें तो मध्य प्रदेश में झूम cultivators को या फिर shifting cultivators को क्या बोला जाता था, they were called as देवार. What is the another name for shifting cultivators? देवार, झूम cultivators. In your further classes, you will know more about the shifting cultivators of the world also. We are talking about some of the, we are talking about shifting cultivators, but at certain areas different names were given are given to the shifting cultivators. Okay, so in Madhya Pradesh it is known as Vivad. In northeastern region it is known as Jhum cultivators, somewhat called them as shifting cultivators. Okay, so the British were uncomfortable with groups who moved about and did not have a fixed home. They wanted tribal groups to settle down and become peasant cultivators. Settled peasants were easier to control and administer than people who were always on the move. The British also wanted a regular revenue sources for the state. So they introduced land settlements, that is, they measured the land, defined the rights of each individual to the land, and fixed the revenue demand for the state. Some peasants were declared landowners, other tenants. Okay, as you have seen, the tenants were to pay rent to the landowner, who in turn paid revenue to the state. So in our previous chapter also we talked about some of the farmers, how Britishers established some of the laws for agriculture, like they first of all they introduced permanent settlement, after that Mehelwadi, after that Munro system. So obviously British were very uncomfortable with the shifting cultivators. Why they were uncomfortable? Because for them it was so difficult to control them, because they are not living in the they were not living in the same place. They were moving from one place to another place, and even if Britishers wanted to contact them, they were not able to, because of their movement so they wanted them to settle down, and they wanted them to become peasant cultivators. क्या peasant cultivators बन जाइए. So because peasant cultivators जो है वो administer करना, ठीक है, Britishers उनको easily administer कर सकते हैं और उनको कंट्रोल कर सकते हैं. ठीक है, उनको बोल दिया गया. पेजेंट का मतलब नॉर्मली क्या होता है, कोई भी एक कल्टिवेटर एक स्मॉल पीस ऑफ लैंड को जब ओन करता है, दैट पर्सन इज नोन एज पेजेंट. ठीक है, तो वो चाहते थे कि आप थोड़ी थोड़ी लैंड ले लीजिए और यहीं पे आप कल्टिवेशन कीजिए. ठीक है, तो The British also wanted a regular revenue source for the state. कि एक फिर अगर आप एक जगह सेटल रहेंगे तो हमें भी रेवेन्यू मिलेगा. They wanted that. They came to India just for making profits. Okay, Britishers came to India just for making profits. That's it. ठीक है, जहां से भी उनको रेवेन्यू जनरेट करना था, वो तरीके निकालते थे कि हम रेवेन्यू कैसे निकाल सकते हैं, हम रेवेन्यू कैसे जनरेट कर सकते हैं. So उन्होंने different land settlements introduced किए. We already talked about those land settlements in our previous chapter, ruling the countryside. Okay, and even tenants जो थे उनको लैंड ओनर को रेंट पे करना होता था एक छोटी सी लैंड के लिए, एंड आफ्टर दैट जो लैंड ओनर था वो क्या करता था, स्टेट को रेवेन्यू पे करता था. The British effort to settle Jhum cultivators was not very successful. Settled plough cultivation is not easy in areas where water is scarce and the soil is dry. In fact, Jhum cultivators who took to plough cultivation often suffered, since their fields did not produce good yields. Yields means the production over the time. ठीक है, उसको हम बोलते हैं yields. So the Jhum cultivators in northeast India insisted on continuing with their traditional practice. Facing widespread protests, the British had to ultimately allow them the right to carry on shifting cultivation in some parts of the world. So British effort to settle Jhum cultivators, it was not very successful, as plough cultivation was not easy for them, and is not easy where the water is scarce or the soil is dry. So Jhum cultivators who took plough cultivation, they suffered a lot, as their fields did not produce good amount of crops, good amount of yields, good amount of production. So they were not so happy. So June cultivators, especially जो north east से, they insisted on continuing with their traditional practices. वो अपनी traditional practice से prefer करते थे और वो करते भी थे. Even Britishers जो है उन्होंने white उनको काफी protest भी देखने को मिले थे. And so eventually Britishers allow them the right to carry on shifting cultivators in some parts of the forest because उनकी जो living थी बहुत ज्यादा hard हो चुके थे. Now just look at this picture. Bhil women cultivating in a forest in Gujarat. This is the picture from Gujarat where Bhil women, Bhil is the name of the tribe, and these women belong from these women belong to Bhil community. Okay, so shifting cultivation continues in many forest areas of Gujarat. You have seen that trees have been cut and land cleared to create patches for cultivation. Just look at this area. लैंड को क्लियर किया जा रहा है, ठीक है. उसके बाद ट्री टॉप्स को भी कट कर दिया जाएगा जिससे कि एग्रीकल्चर के लिए एक इनफ प्लेस मिल जाए. इवन जो सनराइज है, सन रेज जो है डायरेक्टली लैंड पे भी मिले. Okay, now just look at this picture. This is the picture from the tribal workers in a rice field in Andhra Pradesh. Rice field, ठीक है, आंध्र प्रदेश के rice field की ये picture है. Note the difference between rice cultivation in the flat plains and in the forest. ये rice plain, ये plain area में है, अभी ये forest area में है. देखो काफी difference हमें देखने को मिलता है. Okay. So now our next topic is forest laws and their impacts. The life of tribal groups, as you have seen, was directly connected to the forest. So changes in forest laws had a considerable effect on tribal lives. Obviously, forest was the main living for the tribal communities, and the forest laws change होंगे तो obviously tribal की lives change होगी, काफी effect करेगी tribal lives, काफी impact होगा उनपे. So the British extended their control over all forests and declared that forests were state property. So what Britishers did, they took over the control over all over the forest, and they declared that the forest was state property. Forest जो है state property है, government की property है. Even some forests were classified as reserved कि आप वहां पे आ ही नहीं सकते. Why Britishers did that? Why Britishers considered some forests as reserved? Because from those forests they produce timber. Timber is a good quality wood, a very good, very fine quality wood timber. Okay, so Britishers wanted that timber, and that's why they reserved those forests. The entry for the tribal community in those forests were prohibited. So in these forests, people were not allowed to move freely, practice June cultivation, collect fruits or hunt animals. How were June cultivators to survive in such a situation? Now question arises, if forest laws were imposed and even some of the forests got reserved, how did June cultivators survive? How were June cultivators survive in this type of situation? So many were therefore forced to move to other areas in search of work and livelihood. Obviously, for living they had to do something, so they moved to another places in search of work and in search of livelihood. But once the British stopped the tribal people from living inside forests, they faced a problem. From where would the forest department get its laborers to cut trees for railway sleepers and to transport logs? Now just look at this timber. Britishers wanted timber, they wanted to produce timber for the railway lines. At that time railway lines were introduced in India, and for the manufacturing of railway lines they wanted that timber. Okay, so उस टिम्बर को, लॉग्स को कैरी करने के लिए, वुड ट्रीज को कट करने के लिए और लॉग्स को ट्रांसपोर्ट करने के लिए एक जगह से दूसरी जगह मूव तो करना पड़ेगा ना, उसके लिए लेबर की भी तो रिक्वायरमेंट है. अब फॉरेस्ट डिपार्टमेंट को वो लेबर मिलेगा कहाँ से? So colonial officials came up with a solution. They decided they would give June cultivators small patches of land in the forests and allow them to cultivate these on the condition that those who live lived in the villages would have to provide labor to the forest department and look after the forests. So in many regions, the forest department established forest villages to ensure a regular supply of cheap labor. So now colonial official, अब एक ये प्रॉब्लम आ गई थी ब्रिटिश ऑफिशियल्स के पास में colonial officials के सामने, तो they came up with a solution and they decided जितने भी we will provide you a small piece of land. You can cultivate land here, you can cultivate land in this particular forest, but you have to provide us labor. Whenever we want labors for cutting off the trees or for transporting logs, etc., whenever we needed it, we required it, you have to help us. Okay, you have to help us, you have to provide labor to the forest department, and for the look for the and to look after the forest, you have to help us. So फॉरेस्ट डिपार्टमेंट ने क्या किया, फिर नियर बाई ऑब्वियसली अब जो कल्टिवेटर्स पे इस चीज से खुश हो गए थे, उन्होंने बोला ओके, एंड फॉरेस्ट डिपार्टमेंट ने अब क्या फॉरेस्ट विलेजेस बना दिया गए और वहां से उनको रेगुलर सप्लाई मिल रही थी, चीप लेबर मिल रहा था काफी, क्योंकि वो वहीं रहते थे, तुमको चीप लेबर तो मिलेगा ही. So now sleeper, just look at this box, green box, sleeper, the horizontal planks of wood on which railway lines are laid. ठीक है, horizontal planks of wood on which railway lines are laid. railway lines जहाँ पे बिछाई जाती है, railway lines जहाँ पे बनती है, उनको हम क्या बोलते हैं, sleeper बोलते हैं. Okay, so many tribal groups reacted against the colonial forest laws. They disobeyed the new rules, continued with practices that were declared illegal, and at times rose in open rebellion. Such was the revolt of Songram Sangama in 1906 in Assam and the forest satyagraha of the 1930s in the central provinces. Obviously, some were very reluctant about these forest laws. They reacted against it, they disobeyed the rules, they continued their traditional practices, even they continued with practices that were declared illegal, even they protest against it, they rose in open rebellion, open protest. And two of the examples which is mentioned in your book are one of the revolt of Songram Sangama in 1906. Assam में Songram Sangama 1906 में एक revolt चला. After that forest सत्याग्रह 1930s में चिपको मूवमेंट बहुत ही फेमस मूवमेंट है, आपको पता ही होगा, फॉरेस्ट सत्याग्रह चला. ठीक है, so these were like some of the how forest laws impacted the lives of tribals and how tribals reacted against the forest laws. Okay, so now just look at this picture, figure 8. Godara, a woman weaving. देखो weaving हो रही है यहाँ पे. Godara is the name of the tribal community. Okay, so now just look at this. We will do this last topic for today. The problem with trade. Obviously, trade के साथ भी अब कुछ problems हो गई थी. During the 19th century, tribal groups found that traders and money lenders were coming into the forests more often, wanting to buy forest produce, offering cash loans, and asking them to work for wages. It took tribal groups some time to understand the consequences of what was happening. And now, during the 19th century, जो tribal groups थे, they found that traders जो है, ट्रेडर्स, मनी लेंडर्स फॉरेस्ट में आ रहे हैं बहुत ज्यादा. लाइक पहले के कंपैरिजन में अब फॉरेस्ट में उनका जो मूवमेंट है काफी ज्यादा हो गया है, एंड दे रियली वांटेड टू बाय फॉरेस्ट प्रोड्यूस. ठीक है, उनको कैश लोन्स प्रोवाइड कर रहे हैं, उनको फॉरेस्ट की जो ये फॉरेस्ट प्रोड्यूस है उनको उसकी रिक्वायरमेंट है. इवन उनको वेजेस के लिए भी बोल रहे हैं कि आप वर्क करो, वी विल प्रोवाइड यू द वेजेस. तो स्टार्टिंग में तो दे वर लाइक सो हैप्पी, बट आफ्टर सर्टेन टाइम पॉइंट ऑफ टाइम they understood, they understood what was the thing, what were the Britishers or colonial officials thinking, what was the motive of Britishers, what was the motive of Britishers. They understand the consequences of what was happening after sometime. So now let us consider the case of the silk rovers. We will talk about silk rovers. एक example पढ़ते हैं. In the 18th century, Indian silk was in demand in European markets. Obviously, Indian silk, Indian cotton, they were like they are of very fine quality, and even at that time, Indian silk and Indian cotton was of like very fine quality. In all over the world, Indian silk and Indian cotton was considered as the as uh, as very good. Okay, so the fine quality of Indian silk was highly valued, and exports from India increased rapidly. As the market expanded, East India Company officials tried to encourage silk production to meet the growing demand. अब इंडियन सिल्क की वैल्यू बहुत ज्यादा थी. इंडिया से यूरोप में इंडियन सिल्क को एक्सपोर्ट भी किया जा रहा था, और ईस्ट जैसे जैसे मार्केट एक्सपैंड हो रहा था तो ईस्ट इंडिया कंपनी क्या कर रही थी, सिल्क प्रोडक्शन के लिए एनकरेज कर रही थी कि उनके डिमांड्स को फुलफिल हो सके, उनके डिमांड्स, तो इसके लिए वो एनकरेज भी कर रही थी सिल्क प्रोड्यूसर्स को कि आप सिल्क को प्रोड्यूस कीजिए, वी विल प्रोवाइड यू द लोन्स, आप silk produce करना है. So Hazaribagh in present day Jharkhand was an area where Santhals reared cocoons. Cocoons में silk जो है, silk जहाँ पे रहता है उसको हम cocoons बोलते हैं. Cocoons. Covering of thin threads that some insects may protect themselves before becoming adults. ठीक है, एक कवरिंग होती है जिसमें कोई worms होते हैं ना, जो सिल्क worms होते हैं, उसके अंदर वो लेयर्ड में बने हुए होते हैं, और जब तक वो एडल्ट नहीं बनते हैं, जब तक वो तो उसमें क्या होता है, वो एक उसके सलाइवा से वो एक धागा, एक थ्रेड क्रिएट होता है. ठीक है. The traders dealing in silk sent in their agents who gave loans to the tribal people and collected the cocoons. अब देखो ट्रेडर्स भी क्या करते थे, जो भी सिल्क ट्रेडिंग कर रहे थे, सिल्क में डील करते थे, तो उन्होंने अपने एजेंट्स बना रखे थे. ठीक है, और वो फॉरेस्ट में उन्हें भेजा करते थे और बोला करते थे, हाँ वी विल ट्राइबल ग्रुप्स को हम लोन प्रोवाइड करवाएंगे और आप ट्राइबल आप हमें कोकोन्स कलेक्ट करके दे दीजिए. The growers were paid rupees 3 to 4 for 1,000 cocoons. For 1,000 cocoons, they were paid rupees 3 to 4, 3 से 4 रुपए उनको दिया जाता था. And these were exported to Burdwan और गया, where they were sold at 5 times the price. अब देखिए बर्दवान और गया में उनको बेचा जाता था, और उससे किस रेट में बेचा जाता था, 5 times. लाइक अगर कोई 3 रुपए का 3 रुपीज में 1,000 कोकून्स मिल रहा है ना, तो 5 टाइम्स देख लीजिए, 5 to 6 टाइम्स ज्यादा रेट पे बेचा जाता था, कि जो 3 रुपए में लिया उनको 15-16 रुपए में बेचा जा रहा था. The middlemen, so called because they arranged deals between the exporters and silk growers, just because they were like they were dealing with exporters and the silk growers, they made like very huge profits. Silk growers earned very little. Silk growers बहुत ही कम, मतलब ना के बराबर उनकी जो है अर्निंग होती थी. Understandably, many tribal groups saw the market and the traders as their main enemies. After a certain point of time, they thought these traders were their main enemies. They were their main Dikus. Okay, so एक example हो गया silk grower का. Now just look at this figure. A Hajang woman weaving a mat. This woman is weaving a mat. Just look at this woman. For women, domestic work was not confined to the home. They carried their babies with them to the fields and the factories. So obviously, अगर वो काम करने जाएंगे तो उनके बेबी को look after कौन करेगा? So they carried their babies with them, and they did their work. चाहे वो फील्ड्स में काम कर रही हो, चाहे वो फैक्ट्रीज में काम कर रही हो, तो वो क्या करती थी, अपने बेबीज को भी साथ में लेके जाती थी. नाउ द सर्च फॉर वर्क. The plight of the tribals who had to go far away from their homes in search of work was even worse. From the late 19th century, tree plantations started coming up and mining became an important industry. Tribals were recruited in large numbers to work the tea plantations and coal mines of Jharkhand. They were recruited through contractors who paid them miserably low wages and prevented them from returning home. Now, in search of work, many tribal groups, many groups of tribals move from one place to another place. They go far from their homes just for just in search of work, and that condition was very worse. Like 19th century में टी plantations आ गई थी इंडिया में, and माइनिंग भी बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट इंडस्ट्री बन गई थी. इवन माइनिंग इज कंसिडर्ड एज अ किलर इंडस्ट्री ऑल्सो. आई विल टेल यू व्हाई दैट माइनिंग इज कंसिडर्ड एज अ किलर इंडस्ट्री. बट बिफोर दैट टी प्लांटेशन जो है इंडिया में आ गई थी, जो अब ऑब्वियसली टी प्लांटेशन आ गई थी, एंड टी प्लांटेशन इज अ लेबर इंटेंसिव फार्मिंग और कल्टीवेशन. तो उन्होंने ट्राइबल्स को क्या किया, रिक्रूट किया, ठीक है, जॉब पे रखा. बहुत सारे टी प्लांटेशन स्पेशली असम और जो झारखंड की कोल माइंस है वहां पे काफी ट्राइबल ग्रुप्स काम करने के लिए आए थे. उनको रिक्रूट तो कर लिया गया था कॉन्ट्रैक्टर्स, और इनको बहुत ही कम वेजेस मिलते थे, और इनको पता है घर जाने की भी इजाजत नहीं मिलती थी. मतलब उनको घर भी जाने नहीं दिया जाता था. दे प्रिवेंट देम फ्रॉम रिटर्निंग होम, कि आप घर भी नहीं जा सकते हो. So just look at this figure 10. Coal mines of Bihar 1948. In the 1920s, about 50% of the miners in the Jharia and Raniganj coal mines of Bihar were tribals. 50% जो miners थे वो tribals थे. Work deep down in the dark and suffocating mines was not only back-breaking and dangerous, it was often literally killing. That's why it is known as, I told you na ki mining industry was is known as killer industry, because tribals or workers work in a very deep areas, very deep down they work, and that area sorry, that area is like so suffocating and बहुत dangerous भी होता है. Even बैक ब्रेकिंग. व्हाट इज द मीनिंग ऑफ बैक ब्रेकिंग? मतलब फिजिकली डिमांडिंग. फिजिकल डिमांडिंग को हम बोलते हैं बैक ब्रेकिंग, ठीक है. बोलते ना कमर तोड़ काम है. कमर तोड़ मतलब कि आपका फिजिकल मैनुअल लेबर, आपकी मैनुअल लेबर को मानता है. बैक ब्रेकिंग मीन्स फिजिकली डिमांडिंग वर्क है, काफी डेंजरस वर्क है, एंड इवन इसको किलिंग इंडस्ट्री माना जाता था. एंड इन द 1920s over 2000 workers died every year in the coal mines in India. Approximately 2000 वर्कर्स जो है हर साल मरते थे कोल माइंस में. So class, this is all about today. Thank you so much for joining the class. Now we will meet in our next class. Thank you. Bye bye.